Now on Radio 3, it's time for a new series of Vintage Years, in which David Mellor celebrates great artists of the past in conversation with artists of today.
This afternoon's Vintage Years is a real labour of love. I'm celebrating the impact a charismatic Romanian musician had on an English seaside town more than 30 years ago. In the early and middle 60s, I was a schoolboy living not far from Bournemouth, and many's the time I sat in the winter gardens, enthralled as a little man with a Mr. Punch face and a tailcoat so long it threatened to trip him up, stepped up onto the podium to be instantly transformed into one of the most extraordinary musicians I've ever encountered. And if there was one moment when I fell in love with music for life, it was hearing Constantine Silvestri conduct the Bournemouth Symphony Orchestra in Tchaikovsky's Manfred Symphony.
I was absolutely astounded. My first concert was the Manfred, which nobody had played for goodness knows how long, and it was an absolute revelation. I'd done an audition and was for principal cello, and I thought, they've made a terrible mistake. This orchestra is so fantastic. They've made a mistake. And in fact, when we did it at the festival hall, something happened that I've never known happen again, and when we'd finished playing it, the audience ran to the front of the stage to shake us by the hand. They were absolutely stunned, and so was I.
By the time I met Silvestri, I'd already been in the business for 13 years. And I found him a staggering experience. I'd already worked with a distinguished conductor, Sir John Barbaroli, who was famous for getting the very best out of his orchestra, having a team. I mean, the Halley was a very fine orchestra in the late 40s and the 50s. And also, I'd worked for some length with Karajan. I'd been the chorale player in the Philharmonia. But even so, when I realised what this one man could do with an orchestra, how he could make an orchestra of 80, 90 people sound like a solo instrument. And luckily for me, the records are there to prove it. Then I realised he has something really special. And it's a great tragedy that he's not more widely known.
Somehow he was able to make the orchestra think I mean, his tricks with language was very funny. There were some days he didn't know any English at all. And it was purely psychological that if it wasn't going his way, silence would reign. And he would sit there in front of the orchestra, this marvelous courage, not moving until somebody did something and solved this problem. And what he was trying to do was to make, especially the soloists of the orchestra, think for themselves, think what they could do with the next phrase, why would it could fit into the foregoing phrase and so on. And he did this with pieces like Manfred, of course, but he conducted that in such a free and musical way that most of us, especially from Northern Europe, would be much too self-conscious to do.
You talk to any of the older concert goers in Bournemouth who've been through the Rudy Schwartz, Charles Groves, up to Silvestri era. They all speak with tremendous affection of him. And I think it's quite remarkable that in a British seaside resort town, such affection and admiration could be generated in such a short time.
The voices of four of my guests today recalling Constantine Silvestri: Rowena Winfield, then the Bournemouth Orchestra's principal cello, and her husband Roger, the principal oboe. Silvestri's assistant, James Loughran, today himself one of our most distinguished conductors, and the orchestra's former general manager, Ken Matchett, whose inspired idea it was to lure Silvestri to Bournemouth. Silvestri's Manfred became the orchestra's calling card all over Europe, but sadly he never made a commercial recording with them. That extract from the first movement came from a BBC transcription service tape of a performance in the Winter Gardens on the 22nd of February 1963. And perhaps the BBC Radio Classics label could let us have the whole of it one day. Under Silvestri's predecessors, Rudolf Schwartz and Charles Groves, the Bournemouth Orchestra had been a respectable enough ensemble, but the musicians could surely never have dreamt of the tumultuous applause and international recognition they were to win within just a few years of the arrival of Silvestri. And then, less than a decade later, he was gone, dead from liver failure at only 55. Today, I'm trying to recapture that Romanian comet streaking across the south coast, and to explain how a man branded by many as willful and eccentric could at his best force a complete reassessment of the music he was conducting and make a financially insecure provincial orchestra play out of their skins without any dramatic changes of personnel. But Silvestri's own story began a long way from Bournemouth. He was born in 1913 in Bucharest, capital of the then Kingdom of Romania. He was a child prodigy, gifted both as an instrumentalist and as a composer. His first piece was published when he was only 15, and barely out of his teens, he embarked on a successful career as a concert pianist. But his real ambition was to be a conductor. He made his debut at the age of 22 with the Bucharest Radio Symphony Orchestra, and during the Second World War, still not yet 30, he conducted the Berlin Philharmonic. Even the communist takeover of Romania after the war didn't slow his progress. A new biography of Silvestri is due out soon, and I should explain that in preparing this programme, I've been greatly indebted to John Gritten, especially for long-buried details of Silvestri's glittering Romanian career.
Oh, he'd reached the peak of his reputation in Eastern Europe, including the Soviet Union. He'd done many, many concerts in the German Democratic Republic, in Poland, and so on. And also he had received the highest honour which his country could bestow on him. That is, he became the people's artist, as they called it. He was the artistic director of the National Opera and also artistic director of the Radio Symphony Orchestra. He had been, prior to that, the permanent conductor, is the term which they use, most inappropriately as it turned out, of the Bucharest Symphony Orchestra. On the other hand, he had no actual contacts with new trends in the Western world. He used to stay up all night listening to foreign broadcasts and tapes, and he was very interested in any new works which he heard. And also, it's got to be remembered that right up, I think, until 1965, there were Russian advisors in all spheres of life in Romania. And in the radio itself, there was one of these Russian advisors who was, in fact, a general. And he attended all the executive meetings. He had his office next door to the director of the radio, and his decision was always final in these meetings. So you can see that this was the kind of atmosphere in which Silvestri had to work.
Silvestri made several recordings in his Romanian years, but so far as I know, none have been issued in the West or transferred onto CD. To give an idea of why he was such a star behind the Iron Curtain, here's the second movement, the scherzo, of Shostakovich's 10th Symphony, still a very new work when Silvestri and the Romanian Radio and Television Symphony Orchestra introduced it to Bucharest in the mid-50s. The sound may be coarse, but Silvestri's drive and energy still make a considerable impact. Shostakovich's 10th Symphony, with the Romanian Radio and Television Symphony Orchestra conducted by Constantine Silvestri, the subject of this afternoon's Vintage Years. We don't know when that recording was made, but we do know that this symphony had an unexpected part to play in Silvestri becoming known in Britain and ultimately ending up in Bournemouth. John Gritten.
Malcolm Raymond was the critic of the Glasgow Herald, and he was also a composer in his own right, and I believe a jazz trumpeter. And he was visiting Romania and being taken over the radio, the national radio, when he heard the Shostakovich 10th being rehearsed in the concert hall, and he described it as an electrifying experience. So Malcolm very politely said he didn't want to go on with the tour of the radio. He wanted to wait until it was ended so that he could talk to the conductor, who happened to be Silvestri.
Back in the United Kingdom, Malcolm Raymond spoke up strongly for Silvestri. Then as now, the great thing about British musical life is that with so many concerts, orchestral managers are always on the lookout for good conductors who can readily be accommodated, and so it was with Silvestri. On Raymond's recommendation, he was invited to conduct the London Philharmonic Orchestra early in 1957. The visit was a success, and he returned that summer. The following year, 1958, he conducted no less than 7 concerts with the orchestra. He also had the chance to make some recordings of his favourite romantic repertoire, Dvorak's 8th Symphony with the London Philharmonic in July 1957, and over the following 2 years, a number of LPs with the Philharmonia, then at its peak. So much did EMI value him that he even recorded Ravel with the Vienna Philharmonic, an unusual pairing to be sure. Life in the West must have seemed good to Silvestri. The time had come to make the break. After a fracas with the apparatchiks back home over an opera he was conducting, in 1958 Silvestri left his wife in Romania for a tour abroad and never returned. Instead, he settled in Paris, according to John Gritten, largely for non-musical reasons.
I think probably the greatest attraction was the fact that he had fallen in love with another lady whom he'd met in the West when he came for the first time in 1957, and she was living in Paris. And because she was a widow and because of Jewish tradition, she said that he mustn't approach her for another 12 months. But his ardour didn't cool, and after 12 months they started living together. On the other hand, it meant that he had to leave his aged mother, Anna, and knowing perfectly well that once he crossed the Iron Curtain for good, he would never get back again.
And he never did see her again.
And he never did.
Silvestri was now in considerable demand as a guest conductor all over the West, but his arch-romantic interpretations didn't always make life easy for him, or indeed the orchestras he worked with. Until his recent retirement, Brendan O'Brien led the Bournemouth Symphony Orchestra for nearly 30 years. He joined towards the end of Silvestri's tenure, but his appointment to Bournemouth wasn't the first time he'd played under him.
I had first played for him in London, in fact, in the early 60s in the Royal Philharmonic Orchestra. And he, in his program, he had the Tchaikovsky 4th Symphony. And this quiet little man made his way through the orchestra to the podium, and he started off with those brass fanfares at the opening of Tchaik before. And the brass section in that orchestra, well, it was a very fine orchestra, but the brass were particularly good. They were all over the place. He had a very individual approach to those fanfares. He wanted something which I suppose most people would never even dream of. He was a great lover of commas and hesitation and exaggeration and all the rest of it. And the unfortunate brass players were completely bamboozled by his idea. And we spent a long time trying to work out those opening fanfares.
to learn Silvestri, and that's why possibly he didn't get on so well with other orchestras. They didn't have enough time with him. He was idiosyncratic. He had various foibles. One of his foibles was putting commas in the music. And he would exaggerate these commas, you know. We go bum, biddle up, bum, bum, beam, biddle up, bum, bum. We think this is crazy. It's absolutely crazy. And he'd be jumping up and down saying, comma! And we were saying, well, we're trying to do a comma. So when you hear the Tchaikovsky now, I mean, I hate it. I hate it when I hear it, because it isn't right. Dum, biddle up, bum. It's so different from bum, biddle dum, bum, bum.
Rowena Winfield won't be the only one to find Silvestri's Tchaikovsky 4 rather eccentric, so let's hear something altogether more successful from Silvestri's early visits to Britain, the third movement of his Philharmonia reading of Tchaikovsky's Fifth Symphony. At his best, as in this recording, Silvestri was an outstanding interpreter of Tchaikovsky's unique blend of lyrical pessimism. Ray Carpenter was Bournemouth's principal clarinet under Silvestri, and he's now the orchestra's archivist.
He wanted an orchestra that he could mould. You see, the trouble with him was that his methods were so upsetting to musicians, because he wanted them to change their way of playing and their way of thinking, of phrasing, all the things that musicians don't want to do. This is what he demanded. And he couldn't really, he had very uncomfortable times with the big orchestras. He had a lot of trouble with the Philharmonia, I heard, over the grapevine. They enjoyed him, but he was an uncomfortable conductor for a guest.
And he certainly got results from them, because while it's a controversial interpretation, that performance of the Tchaikovsky Fifth Symphony sounds wonderful and is very different from anything you'd ever hear anywhere else.
That's right. He was a wonderful man, Silvestri, for sadness. This is why he did Tchaikovsky so well. He could make music sound the saddest thing. You know, people would cry. I often felt like crying, because it was so... And the way he conducted, he would be limp. He could go very limp. But when it came to the excitement, there was nothing like him for waking up the orchestra, waking up the tempo, making things really buzz.
That was the third movement, the waltz, from Tchaikovsky's Symphony No. 5, Constantine Silvestri conducting the Philharmonia Orchestra, a recording made in the Kingsway Hall, London, in February 1959. Silvestri's difficulty with musicians who didn't know him goes a long way towards explaining why he jumped at the chance of an orchestra of his own, even if it was one of less renown than orchestras like the Philharmonia and the Vienna Philharmonic with whom he'd been making records. On a couple of occasions, Silvestri had appeared as a guest conductor in Bournemouth, where there'd been a long interregnum since Charles Groves had moved on to the Liverpool Philharmonic. Ken Matchett, the orchestra's manager, was deeply impressed, and he was determined to get his man.
After about 12 months, we thought, well, we better start making a decision on this. I then went and spent a weekend with him in Paris, And we got along together personally very well indeed, despite language difficulties. Mine was schoolboy French and his was schoolboy English. But we had a wonderful time, and I put it to him, would he be interested in coming as principal conductor? And he said yes, he'd be very happy to, because he quite genuinely wanted the opportunity to have his own freedom of choice, as it were. He was perfectly honest with me that his repertoire was not necessarily, suited to us, but he was willing to learn, and certainly the British repertoire he had virtually no knowledge of at all. And I have to keep emphasizing this. Our personal rapport was absolutely first class. And I came back, I recommended it to the board agreed, and we appointed him.
So Silvestri came to Bournemouth and gave his first concert as principal conductor in September 1961. As his assistant, James Loughran was well placed to watch how Silvestri set about achieving the results he wanted.
Silvestri had a sound in his head that he was determined that whichever orchestra he conducted was going to make that sound. Now, it so happened that it was so demanding to understand that he did it best with his own orchestra because it took time. And therefore, that time, I suppose, you could interpret as being he was training the orchestra to think in his way, rather than looking at it coldly and analytically, that he was training the violins to be better, etc. He was thinking of a sound. The Bournemouth Orchestra was going to be like a quartet to him. They all had to listen to one another and they had to play as a quartet. He did not want the kind of music making that unfortunately is prevalent because of economic circumstances, people making too much music. He did not want musical typists in front of him.
For the player's view of Silvestri, the orchestral trainer, I talked to 4 members of his orchestra, Roger and Rowena Winfield, Ray Carpenter and David Sheen, who spent 40 years in the first violins at Bournemouth.
Now, I think that when you use the word trainer, that's a particularly good word. He was particularly good in rehearsal. Now, some of his demands, if other conductors had come along with them, you would have thought they were rather eccentric. They were certainly very individual. But he was able to put across his reasons for it and use it for shaping music in the way he wanted to shape it. Now, at rehearsal, it was in the days when conductors would go round desk by desk. This wouldn't be done now. But it was never done in a malicious sort of way. There was never the feeling of a witch hunt.
Did he ask you to do things you couldn't do, or did he recognise what you were capable of and try and get you to achieve it?
I think he did. I think that's a fair comment. Yes, his was the art of the possible.
Did you enjoy rehearsals? Were they fun?
I enjoyed rehearsals. Now, I wouldn't say they were fun. They were serious. We always knew what sort of mood he would be in. He had a particular brown suit and a tie to go with it, which was terribly long. He was an immaculately turned out little man. And if he turned up in the brown suit, we knew it was going to be sort of a day where nothing was going to be right. And it was going to be a little bit Dolorosa, shall we say.
You know, he used to turn up in a brown suit if he was going to give somebody a bad time or he wasn't feeling too good. And the whisper used to go, he's got his brown suit on. So everybody would practice their bits. It was an amazing experience to be at one of his rehearsals. But you never felt safe with him. Never felt safe at all. I never did the whole time I was there. But I was congratulating myself that he hadn't tackled me.
When he did over a Dvorak symphony, I think.
Yeah, that's right. I think it's Dvorak 7. And this morning he came in and came to my solo, heard it through, put his baton down, took out his cigarette case and lit up, which was the signal. You see, everybody did the same, crossed their legs, put their instruments down. They knew that I was in for it. And he said, Mr. Carpenter, you will play that again, maybe with a bit more warmth. So I did it, and I put a bit of vibrato on. You see, to warm it up a bit. He said, "What is it?" You see, so whatever I did was wrong. And for a good half an hour, 3/4 of an hour, he concentrated on this solo. He spoke to the orchestra about my family, how many children I had. So, I should have a feeling of a lullaby. I should be able to play this solo very well. This is what we all went through, one by one, around the orchestra.
Described as like that, it could sound a little sadistic, but that was not the impression.
No, you see, I sometimes would end a concert feeling as though I could murder him, or a rehearsal. But it all was washed over when you got to a good performance. You played well, and he would stand you up, he'd make a real fuss of you. He was the severest critic and the most generous person when he wanted to give praise, and he did.
But he'd turn his back on the orchestra and he'd say, fourth desk, second violins, inside player, 4 bars before the second movement Brahms. And sure as anything, he'd got the bit that they couldn't play. And again, that was very good psychology, because people used to go and get the parts out from the library and make sure that they jolly well could play it, because nobody liked to be shown up in front of their peers. But it was sort of fairly anonymous, He didn't say, you do it. And conductors come to orchestras and they don't like him and they don't like her, and he's got to go, and we'll reorganise all the first violins and everything. Well, Silvestri took what he had and within weeks had made it one of the top orchestras. The orchestra got this fantastic reputation with the same players that it didn't have the fantastic reputation with, because he made you play better than you could.
It was a
tremendously secure feeling. He held you, and you couldn't fall.
He didn't talk a great deal. In fact, he talked extremely few words. I mean, his English was absolutely appalling. I can honestly say that these days conductors will say more in 10 minutes than he said in the whole of the 8 years I worked with him. It was all done by gesture or by analogy, some sort of comparing it with something else. But the language was there. To a musician, the language was there. And it was once you hit his wavelength, which by a miracle the entire orchestra did, then the ball started rolling, you see.
Unfortunately, Silvestri lived to make very few commercial recordings in Bournemouth, but those that there are very good, and some are quite exceptional. Like Tchaikovsky's Manfred, Rimsky-Korsakov's Scheherezade was another of Silvestri's party pieces. He recorded it in December 1967, and in a moment we shall hear the lyrical slow movement entitled The Young Prince and the Young Princess. Ray Carpenter was there.
Silvestri, one of his greatest strengths was to be able to get us to play with colour. Now, that's a strange thing to say from a musician. How can you play with colour? But you did. He had ways of getting colour. I'll tell you a little story. He was getting the first violins to play da-da-dee, da-dee-dee, da-da-da, that well-known tune. And he couldn't get this romantic lushness that he wanted. He said, "Why can't you play with feeling, with passion?" And all this he was going on at the first violins. He turned to the bass. He said, "The basses, they play sexy. The violas play sexy. The cellos, even the second violin, the first violin. Why can't you?" He said, "I know what. I bring you some pictures."
Oh, you're going to produce some nude women?
Oh, no. Yes. I mean, I suppose what would he mean? Some naughty, erotic pictures to make them play with a romantic feeling, whatever. It was a joke. It was a joke. But he put it over to us. I mean, he always managed to bring a picture to our minds. He would make us think in colour almost, so that we got the feeling of what he wanted. Amazing. And this is all in Scheherezade.
That was the third movement of Rimsky-Korsakov's Scheherezade, the Bournemouth Symphony Orchestra, conducted by Constantine Silvestri, the subject of this afternoon's Vintage Years, a recording made in the Winter Gardens, Bournemouth, in December 1967. Now, what about Silvestri the man? Off the podium, he was almost entirely devoid of ego, which made him popular with his players, though his limited English precluded close contact with most of them, however much they might have wanted it. David Sheen had only one personal conversation with Silvestri in all the years they were together.
He used to go abroad conducting great orchestras, and he had just come back from Rome and Philadelphia. And it was a lovely day outside of the back of the Winter Gardens, one of Bournemouth's nice summer days. And I happened to be out there in the sun, and he came out. So I said to him, is the orchestra in Philadelphia as good as we are told it is? Oh, yes, he said, fantastic. My first concert, he said, was not a great success. Obviously, they hadn't followed what he wanted. But my second one was a great success. And I then said, and what about in Rome? And he looked up at the lovely sky and he said, I think in Rome, he said, the weather is too nice, he said, for rehearsing orchestras. And he said, I had the feeling, he said, that the older players were thinking about the football and the younger ones were thinking about Sophia Loren. And that was the only conversation I ever had with Silvestri on a one-to-one basis.
Others, like the orchestra's general manager, Ken Matchett, got to know Silvestri a bit better. The oboist Roger Winfield remembers how Silvestri used to go fishing with Ken. Silvestri also kept his love of radio, hi-fi and gadgetry of all kinds. He loved to relax with his second wife Regina and their friends, particularly after a concert over a good meal. But in essence, he was a solitary man and something of a workaholic, and when he wasn't rehearsing or performing, he was more than likely to be found preparing scores in his flat, just a short walk from the Winter Gardens. As the orchestra's leader, Brendan O'Brien often went to visit him there.
I remember once going over to his flat for some reason or other, and it was an odd experience. He had the television on. At the same time he was listening to a record. He had some cricket match, a football match or something on something else, and he was in love with music. He was in love with listening to other interpreters. He was an avid listener to recordings. And he had a number of scores lying open around the place, and I couldn't help but notice that these scores were plastered with multicolored markings. And I remember asking him once, what is the green? And he had a code of his own. That green might be Furtwängler, or red might be somebody else. I was intrigued by it.
I was intrigued too, so I asked James Loughran to explain this strange habit.
He worked a bit like a lawyer. He would go and look up other cases, as it were, and how it was dealt with. And so, as you quite rightly say, at the beginning of his scores, he would have in different coloured pencils the metronome marks of all the various conductors, what tempo they took this particular passage. And he would think about this. And I found that this study and the research that he did was admirable, something that I emulated or tried to emulate, to try and find out as much from colleagues as you can.
What did he teach you?
The strange thing, he taught me by example. He never ever dictated to me what I should do. And I was a young, keen conductor, critical of the whole world at that age, of course. But we worked very much as a team. He was a very trusting person. He would leave me with the orchestra for months, to cope. And the orchestra, fortunately, was very, very good. And they were teaching me. I mean, I learnt my art with this orchestra. I owe everything to them. And he was a very supportive man. I remember an occasion where some of the orchestra came to me rather angrily and said, "What says we hear you criticizing our performance yesterday of Leonora 3? I said, "I don't know what you're talking about." "Oh, Silvestri has just said that the assistant thought that our performance in Bristol last night, or Southampton, I can't remember, wasn't very good." And I said, oh, I think he's stirring trouble up. I didn't say anything of the sort. So I went to him and said, what's this you're saying? Oh, no, they've got it all wrong. I said, l'assistance, the audience last night didn't like our performance. So he went in front of the orchestra dutifully and said, ladies and gentlemen, you've got it quite wrong. And in any case, Mr. Loughran is not my assistant conductor. I am his assistant conductor. I help him.
When Silvestri came to Bournemouth, he knew no British music at all, but it's typical of his integrity that he felt he had to learn some. He soon began an intense love affair with Elgar, as well as developing a warm regard for the music of Ralph Vaughan Williams. All too little of his forays into British music survive, and only one LP was recorded commercially, but fortunately it's absolutely terrific, perhaps Silvestri's finest gramophone achievement. It contains one of the greatest of all Elgar recordings, Silvestri's reading of the underrated concert overture Alassio in the South, with which I shall end this afternoon's programme, as well as two Vaughan Williams pieces, the overture The Wasps and the Fantasia on a theme by Thomas Tallis. As you'll hear in a moment, the Fantasia receives a rich and expansive performance, benefiting from the warm acoustic of Winchester Cathedral where it was recorded. Silvestri's reading lasts nearly 17 minutes. Half of the course is something over 14, and indeed Dimitri Mitropoulos even managed to finish in under 13. Inevitably, some people have criticised his performance for being unidiomatic, too red-blooded and Latin, but David Sheen, who played in the sessions at Winchester, disagrees.
Well, it's the hot-blooded Latin, but it's the spiritual quality of him. He would often, in rehearsal, we must think of God. Now, I don't know Silvestri's particular religion, but he was a man of great spirituality. And in the opening concerts we did with him, we went round to the main cathedrals in our region. Salisbury was one, Wells, and I think Winchester. Now, as a result of that, we did a most splendid TV thing with Southern Television, where they cleared the cathedral and highlighted the architectural merits with their cameras while we played from Parsifal. Now, Silvestri liked all of this. And I think that he saw the religious, or shall we say the fine spiritual quality of the Tallis Fantasy, and he would have thought that this was a good place to do it.
That was Vaughan Williams' Fantasia on a theme by Thomas Tallis, the Bournemouth Symphony Orchestra conducted by Constantine Silvestri, the subject of this afternoon's Vintage Years, a recording made in Winchester Cathedral in September 1967. Silvestri only worked part of the year in Bournemouth, leaving the orchestra in the tender care of James Loughran and giving them a well-deserved break from his demands. He spent his time away on lucrative guest engagements because, as General Manager Ken Matchett confesses, the conductor's salary from Bournemouth was small, more or less what a jet-set maestro would expect for just one engagement today. Not that Silvestri cared all that much.
Money didn't mean a damn thing to him. And through his agent, who'd introduced him to some accountant in London, he'd been told, now, whatever you do, keep all receipts, cash receipts for your expenditure and so on, because it all comes off your income tax, you see. Well, you know of Regina, do you? His wife, Pooper. Well, she couldn't cook. I mean, she's an extremely elegant lady, Pooper. And so they used to go to a little restaurant which no longer exists in Bournemouth called the Panoramic Grill, which was just down the road from a flat they bought, and eat all their meals there. And he loved entertaining. I mean, we used to go out to dinner and supper and lunch or whatever, time and time. And he loved having people around and entertaining, especially after a performance. We spent hours talking about different things. And of course, imbibing, which was something he enjoyed doing. And often, you know, in the continental style, he would water the wine. And he rang me up one day and said that this accountant was telling him that he couldn't claim his income tax, you see. So I thought, well, I'll go and see if I can sort this out. And he got something like £15,000 worth of receipts for food and hotel bills and all that, far more than he'd actually earned, you see, in the belief, well, he only had to show these and, you know, all was well. I'm afraid he was totally naive about matters financial.
When Silvestri died early in 1969, aged only 55, the cause of death was liver cancer complicated by cirrhosis. Excessive drinking is a well-known factor in cirrhosis, and in Romania, the young Silvestri had a reputation for more than just imbibing. But all our Bournemouth contributors agreed that while he enjoyed a drink, they never saw him the worse for alcohol. And yet there's no doubt that Silvestri didn't help himself. James Loughran.
But you know how and why. I mean, he was never alcoholic in any way, because his dear widow told me, when he was alive, Jimmy, don't you do what Constantine does. And it was simply this, that the only time he felt he could study was between midnight and 5 o'clock in the morning when the phone wouldn't ring. He would come to a concert, or he would do a concert, we would all go for dinner, we'd have a lovely time, and at midnight we'd all go our separate ways, and he would go back and work hard. And he would have, just as company, would have a bottle of wine. And it was perhaps this bottle of wine over the years, just having a glass of wine as he's going through the scores, caused his liver to have an ulcer.
And despite the support Silvestri got from his devoted wife Regina, life can't have been easy for an exile completely cut off by the Iron Curtain from his homeland. And as Rowena Winfield remembers, back in the 60s, we British were far less aware than now of places like Romania.
You think back now, I mean, you know, we didn't understand about Eastern Europe. What we knew about Romania, you could write on a pin. But looking back now, he must have been very homesick and he must have been very lonely. And he had to carve out a career for himself, which he did admirably. But, you know, sometimes I look back now and think that when he seemed to be a little bit difficult, he was maybe ill and maybe homesick. He couldn't really communicate with people because his English was so poor. When we went to Wales, I must tell you that as well, we did a tour of Wales, and I think he was very homesick at the time, and he didn't want to go. He didn't want Wales. What is Wales? And of course he got there and saw all the mountains and everything, and it reminded him of Romania, didn't it? And he absolutely fell in love with it. And they took him to the station, which has got a sort of 3 feet long name, and he bought about 24 platform tickets as a souvenir. He loved it. But yes, I think looking back, he was probably homesick and probably lonely.
One thing Silvestri did bring with him from Romania were his compositions, but it was typical of the man that he never encouraged the Bournemouth Symphony Orchestra to play any of them. Indeed, few of the players even knew he was a composer. One of the rare works they did programme was Silvestri's set of 3 short pieces for strings. In a moment, we'll hear the last of them in a premiere CD recording by the London Schubert Players. The group's director is the pianist Anastasescu, who's married to Silvestri's biographer, John Gritten. She knows from personal experience how the Romanian state regarded émigrés like Silvestri.
I am a Romanian who left Romania, who became a British citizen. I can put myself in Silvestri's place very easily, and I feel very sad that a person with such a professional status could be forgotten after only 20 years. Like any Romanian who would have left Romania and be considered, in a way, as a traitor. People didn't use their names in conversations anymore. His name has been erased from textbooks as well. And nobody played his music, not in my time. But after the Romanian Revolution, I embarked on a series of concerts with my own chamber orchestra from here, the London Schubert Players, in aid of some very big centers for handicapped children. And as a gesture towards the Romanian audiences, I asked if they would recommend to us and give us the music of a small piece by a Romanian composer. And it was at that point that the director of the concert agency sent me the 3 pieces for strings of Silvestri's, saying, "This is a gem, and nobody plays it anymore. Try it." So I took the music, I read it on the piano, I read it with the orchestra, and I was amazed. The orchestra fell in love with the pieces. We did them to great acclaim in Romania, and we actually encored them even in Bucharest, in the most prestigious hall, so obviously people really liked it. I thought, if this piece of music is written by him and we don't know that this composition exists, someone has to do something about it.
That was the last of the 3 pieces for strings by Constantine Silvestri, the London Schubert Players, directed by Nicholas Miller, a recording that was actually made in Bucharest in October 1990. As it turned out, Silvestri's tenure as principal conductor in Bournemouth was little more than 7 years. In that time, the Bournemouth Sinfonietta was set up, audiences and critics were won over, there were national and foreign tours, and the start of a well-received series of recordings. But Ken Matchett feels Silvestri achieved something far more durable than good notices for a provincial orchestra with shaky finances.
Quite frankly, I mean, you know, since 1954, when I was brought in to see whether there should be a Bournemouth orchestra or not, it's been a struggle. It is still a struggle. It will always be a struggle because you're fighting for standards of quality against the financial odds all the time and against political climates and all the rest of it. What Silvestri did, I would suggest, was so demonstrated that an instrument could be produced. And bear in mind, he allowed me, and I say that deliberately, the word, he allowed me to form the Sinfonietta to cope with the smaller towns. Not that he didn't want to do the smaller towns, in fact he did quite a lot of it, but he recognized that for this orchestra to exist, it had to provide that service. And I would say that Silvestri established that this was an art form that couldn't be easily destroyed. And that's, I think, is the most important aspect of his tenure.
Silvestri's legacy to British musical life generally has been more subtle. Even before his death, several of his key players, like Roger and Rowena Winfield, left Bournemouth for greener pastures elsewhere. They're now with the Northern Sinfonia, but they carry with them more than just their memories of Silvestri.
I mean, certainly to this day, I use Silvestri bowings. I'm converting the whole of the north of England to Silvestri bowings. Slowly. But everybody loves them, and they're very different.
People do say that the BSO has a unique sound, which the older players may put down to the resonances of Silvestri. And there are 1 or 2 players in London who are either pupils of people who play for Silvestri, who do play. I mean, for instance, I won't mention names, but a wind player who plays with the flexibility of a string player. That is typically Silvestri.
We felt, actually, I have to say, we felt very guilty because the key players that he lost the leader and Roger, principal oboe, and me, principal cello, and the principal viola. For some reason, we all left at well, obviously we left at the same time. And it was quite soon after that, wasn't it, that he died, and we felt, rightly or wrongly, that it mightn't have happened if we'd stayed, you know.
The problem is that because the orchestra had become so, well, good as a group, it fell inevitably to the London raid. I'd already been in one orchestra in the 50s which had been raided. The Halle in 1953, the orchestra lost something like 10 of its key players, and it was never quite the same. Well, I'm afraid the same thing happened with Bournemouth. And as a result of this particular raid, one orchestra gained 4 players, and it's difficult to resist, particularly if you might say to yourself, it's the last chance you've got to work in the big city.
Silvestri died in February 1969. James Loughran was one of the last to see him alive.
I had been slightly out of touch working in Scotland and abroad, and someone told me that he had been taken to the Royal Free Hospital in London and with some liver complaint. And so I was conducting in London and decided I'd go and see him. Was quite shocked by this building, rows and rows of beds on either side. They seemed to go on for ages, and I couldn't see Silvestri anywhere. I walked down this corridor, I passed him without knowing, and then I looked back, and there was a figure hunched over a radio receiver with his earphones on. I thought, that must be Silvestri. He'll be the one listening to music. Still not recognizing him. This was the terrible thing. Until I got near him, and I saw the eyes, which you couldn't miss. I mean, because he'd had this wonderful big Fernandel face, you know, and that was gone, but only the eyes were there. And the power of music and the the love of music this man had was shown in a flash. He recognized me and immediately became alive and started to attack me for using horns in Haydn's 27th Symphony that he'd had a recording of. He no longer thought he was ill. He was sitting up and full of fire and passion about this and saying he'd seen the original manuscript and blah, blah, blah. And that's a memory I'll never forget. And it's a great example of his dedication to the end, and also reflects what music meant to him.
Silvestri's death hit Bournemouth very hard, though for players like Ray Carpenter, feelings were mixed.
I guess it would be a combination of relief in some quarters, because the pressure was off. I mean, you can't imagine the pressure that he put on us. Every week, a new piece, a new concept, a new way of thinking. You never could rest on your laurels. If he praised you one week, you were damned the next. Life was one huge... And when he went away, I mean, he'd only come for 3 months or so, and then he'd go away and come back again. Great relief when he went. I mean, I have to say it. I myself, great relief. But when we were actually working, it was a real buzz about the man. It was fantastic. And when he died, I think there was a great sadness, because we'd been through something quite unique, unrepeatable probably.
Oh, it was a tragedy. People were so saddened by it. Here was a man, he was only in his mid-50s, and the turnout at his funeral in St. Peter's Church in Bournemouth was just the most, there wasn't a dry eye in the place. The church was packed, and it was a very moving thing, yes.
David Sheen. I'm going to end this afternoon's Vintage Years, devoted to the short time the Romanian conductor Constantine Silvestri spent in Bournemouth, with his finest recorded achievement, Elgar's concert overture Alassio in the South. But how on earth could a Romanian with no previous knowledge of English music get so close to the heart of Elgar? James Loughran.
We have to put it down to Ken Russell's film. He was greatly moved by this film. I remember him saying, did you see that his poor wife had to draw the ledger line, or the stave lines for Elgar? You see, they couldn't afford manuscript paper. And the whole film moved him tremendously, so much so that he threw himself into the study of Elgar. And he loved a tremendous amount about England, and somehow this was, I think, the culmination of his stay in England, was this recording, because I felt, not from a sentimental point of view, but this was the real Silvestri coming out. It's not overblown, but it's heraldic. It's very moving of that particular era. And he captures, I think, the right spirit of Elgar and the imagination. So this was the Silvestri I would like to remember.
This famous recording even won golden opinions from the doyen of Elgar interpreters. When Roger Winfield left Bournemouth, he went to play in the London Philharmonic under Sir Adrian Boult. I'd
only been in the LPO a matter of months, and he came up to me and he said, he was all terribly polite, Mr. Winfield, a very distinguished man. I must say, I've just heard that recording by old chap in Bournemouth, Silvestri, in the South. He's wonderful. That's a wonderful performance. Elgar would have loved it. And I'll tell you now, that's the only time, in my experience, that I've known of one conductor make a really open, candid compliment to another. It really is the only time. And I must say that made quite an impression on me. Felt quite sad, actually.
Constantine Silvestri was not one of the greatest conductors of the century. His interpretations were often too mannered and idiosyncratic for that. But as you'll hear when we finish with this matchless Elgar recording, he was a musician of extraordinary gifts, and at his finest, he could shine such a penetrating light on a piece that we hear it as if for the first time. Still, as our contributors have shown repeatedly this afternoon, it isn't technical mastery that remains their lasting memory of Silvestri, but his humanity, his simple yet absolute love of the music he conducted, and the wordless eloquence with which he conveyed that love to his players and his audience. His passion for Elgar ran particularly deep, and it was most affecting to hear how moved Ken Matchett was by this side of Silvestri. In the end, for me, this is his finest memorial, that so many years after his tragically premature death, he still inspires those who worked with him with so much love and respect.
He became very fond of Elgar and was going to do Gerontius and asked me for hours and hours and hours of rehearsal, which we managed to plan in. Incidentally, he'd been brought up as a Roman Catholic.
Mm-hmm.
Now, we got to, I think, about 12 hours before the final rehearsal and concert of Gerontius. And he came to me and he said, I can't do Gerontius. Would you ask Charles Groves to do it? So I said, by all means. He had a great respect for Charles.
Mm.
So I got Charles in, and it was a wonderful performance. Excuse me. But I was rather fond of him. At the end of Gerontius, there was a tremendous ovation. And he was in the audience. Charles, of course, acknowledged him and rose him to take a bow. And the audience left eventually after many, many calls. He sat there for nearly an hour. Nearly an hour, totally overcome. That was the man.